February 12th, 1944. 30,000 feet over central Germany, the frozen air outside the plexiglass nose of a B-17 flying fortress shimmered with contrails. Lieutenant James Red Hanlon, bombardier of the 342nd Bomb Squadron, 91st Bomb Group, leaned into his Norden bombsight, his gloved hands adjusting the fine crosshairs over a jagged patch of smoke and haze that only vaguely resembled the city of Leipzig. Below him, visibility was collapsing into an indistinct grey. The target, the Erla Maschinenwerke aircraft factory complex, should have appeared directly beneath the formation in less than 30 seconds, but Hanlon could no longer see it. The layer of industrial haze, combined with flak bursts drifting across their approach path, had erased the landscape. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. And yet, at 21 seconds before the factory would have passed directly under their formation, Hanlon squeezed the release lever. The bomb bay doors vibrated as 5 tons of demolition bombs fell free, vanishing into the cloud deck below a full 15 seconds before every textbook of the U.S. Army Air Forces said he should have released them. Captain William Bill Heller, the pilot, looked over his shoulder in disbelief. "We're short of the target," he shouted over the interphone. Hanlon didn't answer. He simply watched his bombsight readouts. Then, 43 seconds later, when the first fireball blossomed through the haze exactly where the Erla complex lay, he understood that he had not been short at all. He had been early, deliberately early, and somehow that had made all the difference. For the past 2 years of daylight precision bombing, U.S. bombardiers had been taught the same doctrine: drop only when the crosshairs aligned, precisely over the visual aiming point. The Norden bombsight, that sacred mechanical computer of glass and gyros, promised pickle-barrel accuracy, a bomb within 75 feet of its target from 6 miles up. It was the pride of American air power, the justification for daylight bombing itself. But by the winter of 1944, that faith was collapsing. Bombardiers like Hanlon had discovered something that their instructors at Albuquerque and Langley could never have imagined: that the bombsight was telling the truth, but the air wasn't. The irony was profound. The very precision that the U.S. 8th Air Force had built its doctrine upon the belief that accuracy could be computed through mathematics alone was being undone by physics itself. To understand how an entire generation of aviators came to release their bombs before the target and yet hit with greater accuracy, we must first step back into the world they were trained to believe in, a world where faith in instruments was almost a religion. In the summer of 1942, as the first American heavy bomber crews began arriving in England, the doctrine of daylight precision bombing stood as the central dogma of U.S. air strategy. Developed in the 1930s at Maxwell Field and refined by the Air Corps Tactical School, it held that a formation of heavily armed bombers, flying in tight formation and guided by the Norden bombsight, could strike vital industrial targets with surgical precision. The theory was elegant. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which had turned to night area bombing after devastating losses in 1940, the Americans would attack in daylight. Their targets would be power plants, oil refineries, aircraft assembly plants, and ball-bearing works, the sinews of the German war machine. Destroy those, and the Reich would collapse from within. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, one of the architects of the doctrine, described it as a strategy of paralysis. The bomber would not merely destroy armies, it would dismantle the enemy's ability to wage war at all. The key was the Norden bombsight. Developed by Dutch engineer Carl Norden and refined through the 1930s, it was a marvel of mechanical computation. A stabilized optical sight linked to a miniature analog computer, the Norden calculated the trajectory of a falling bomb by continuously solving the equations of motion: airspeed, altitude, wind drift, and ground speed. When properly used, it could adjust the bomber's course automatically, keeping the target centered in the crosshairs. Every bombardier trained in the U.S. Army Air Forces swore an oath to protect its secrecy. Instructors told them it was the most closely guarded instrument of the war, more valuable, in some cases, than the aircraft itself. Each bombsight was stored under armed guard. When missions returned, crews relocked them in steel safes. During training, bombardiers practiced for months at low altitude over mock targets in the desert. Each bomb was a sand-filled practice shell with a small flare that ignited on impact, marking accuracy to within yards. Under controlled conditions, the Norden's performance was astonishing. But the skies over Germany were not controlled conditions. From late 1942 through early 1943, the first U.S. raids into occupied Europe, Rouen, Lille, Saint-Nazaire, confirmed both the promise and the peril of the doctrine. When weather and visibility cooperated, results were impressive. Concentrated hits within factory compounds, rail yards disrupted for weeks. But in most missions, results varied wildly. Clouds, smoke, or flak bursts obscured the aiming point. Bombs fell hundreds, even thousands of feet off target. Intelligence analysts at the 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section, led by Colonel Curtis LeMay's staff, began compiling statistical analyses of bombing accuracy. In the fall of 1943, they determined that even under clear visual conditions, only about 20% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. Under partial cloud or haze, accuracy dropped below 5%. The discrepancy was not simply human error. Even the most skilled bombardiers were discovering that something invisible was shifting their impacts, a subtle but consistent offset, as if an unseen hand were pushing the bombs sideways or forward in flight. The British, flying at night, had already abandoned any pretense of pinpoint accuracy, choosing instead to devastate entire city centers. But for the Americans, who had built their entire strategic justification around precision, this was a crisis of faith. When the 8th Air Force began its full-scale campaign against the German aircraft industry in late 1943, the crisis deepened. On missions against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, American crews faced ferocious opposition. Flak batteries around industrial targets were calibrated by radar to detonate at precise altitudes, creating walls of black shrapnel. Visibility over the targets was often obscured by smoke, contrails, or overcast skies. Bombardiers, desperate to avoid mid-air collisions in the tightly packed combat box formations, began releasing their loads when the lead ship dropped, trusting that the lead bombardier's sighting was accurate. But even the lead bombardiers found themselves struggling. The 8th Air Force's bombing photos told a grim story, massive bomb concentrations falling a full quarter of a mile beyond their intended targets. The factories still stood. The bombsight data had been perfect. The error was not mechanical, it was environmental. By early 1944, operational research officers began to notice a pattern. In hundreds of bomb strike photographs, the centers of impact consistently fell beyond the targets, not short of them. The bias was so systematic that it could not be attributed to random error. At first, investigators suspected instrument lag. Perhaps the bombsight's gyros were slightly slow in compensating for changes in aircraft pitch. But when test drops were conducted over England in controlled airspace, the bombs fell exactly where predicted. The fault only appeared in combat at high altitude, over continental Europe, where the jet stream flowed unseen. It was here that American crews began to confront one of the most misunderstood forces of the Second World War. The discovery of the upper atmospheric wind corridor, now known as the polar front jet stream. The first hints came from the bomber crews themselves. Pilots returning from missions over Germany reported ground speeds far higher than expected when flying east, and sluggish returns when heading west. Meteorological officers at the 8th Air Force's Weather Center in High Wycombe began correlating these reports with data from B-24, Liberators, equipped for reconnaissance. By late January of 1944, they confirmed what Japanese meteorologist Wasaburo Oishi had observed 2 decades earlier, but few in the West had believed, that at altitudes above 25,000 feet, narrow rivers of air could flow at more than 150 miles per hour. The Norden bombsight, for all its brilliance, had not been designed for such conditions. It assumed relatively stable wind layers that could be measured by drift sights at lower altitudes. But in the upper stratosphere, wind velocity could vary dramatically between altitude bands only a few hundred feet apart. As a result, the Bombardiers' calculations based on the assumption of steady, uniform wind produced a systematic overrun. The bombs retained forward velocity from the high-speed aircraft and continued traveling well beyond the intended target before impact. The solution, discovered not in laboratories but in the freezing noses of bombers over Germany, was simple yet revolutionary. Release early. Crews began experimenting, at first unofficially, with pre-release corrections dropping their bombs a few seconds before the crosshairs reached the aiming point. To the doctrine-bound instructors back in the United States, this was heresy. But to the men in combat, it was survival. Lieutenant Hanlon's mission on February 12th, 1944, was among the first recorded where the early release technique proved decisive. Post-strike reconnaissance photos showed that his bombs had landed directly on the Erla complex, collapsing assembly halls and starting fires visible for miles. Analysis later confirmed that his release occurred approximately 12 seconds before calculated target alignment, compensating almost perfectly for a 200-mile-per-hour tailwind in the jet stream. The 8th Air Force's analysts took note. Over the following months, early release correction tables were quietly incorporated into bombardier briefings. What had begun as battlefield improvisation soon became institutionalized procedure, though officially it was still considered a pilot's discretion adjustment. Yet behind this pragmatic change lay something deeper, the slow unraveling of a doctrine that had once seemed mathematically unassailable. By the spring of 1944, the phenomenon of pre-release bombing had quietly spread across the heavy bomber groups of the 8th Air Force. Crews at Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, and Kimballton all began to record similar adjustments in their mission logs. The Norden bombsight remained sacred, officially untouched, yet everyone who used it in combat knew that its perfection had limits. The adjustment was never written into the field manuals. It was passed instead through whispered advice during briefings, penciled notes on bomb run charts, or in the few words of a veteran to a newly assigned bombardier. Release early, kid, they'd say. The air's faster than the books think. For the U. The entire daylight bombing doctrine had been founded on the idea that human intuition could be replaced by scientific calculation. Now, the human factor, the very instinct the machine was meant to eliminate, had become indispensable again. At Thorpe Abbotts, home of the 100th Bomb Group, Bombardier Lieutenant Robert Rosenthal described his growing mistrust of the Norden's mechanical certainty. The bombsight was perfect in theory, he recalled after the war. But war doesn't happen in theory. The wind up there had a mind of its own. Rosenthal's crew, flying their B-17 nicknamed Rosie's Riveters, began recording systematic pre-releases of up to 15 seconds. Reconnaissance photographs showed their bomb patterns tightening, strike accuracy improving dramatically. Their missions against Münster and Hanover in April of 1944 were among the first where 8th Air Force analysts formally acknowledged that visual early release corrections produced measurably better results than doctrinal Norden timing. The revelation forced a reckoning at the upper levels of command. Colonel Curtis LeMay, at that time commanding the 3rd Bomb Division, was among the first to translate field improvisation into structured procedure. LeMay was no romantic. He trusted instruments and discipline above all else, but he trusted results even more. In May of 1944, LeMay's staff at High Wycombe issued a confidential directive labelled Combat Bombing Accuracy, Experimental Corrections for High-Altitude Winds. It advised bombardiers to evaluate mean wind drift differentials at altitude and to consider compensated lead release under strong tailwind conditions exceeding 100 knots. The words were bureaucratic, but the implication was radical. The bombsight's own solutions were no longer sufficient. The human operator, interpreting the invisible physics of the sky, was again the final authority. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand why this shift mattered, one must appreciate the precision obsession that had defined American air strategy since its inception. The Air Corps Tactical School had preached that technology could purify war, that with enough data, enough mechanical sophistication, bombing could become a kind of surgery, excising factories while sparing civilians, but high-altitude winds made a mockery of that dream. Over Germany, the jet stream turned bomb trajectories into complex parabolas. At 30,000 feet, a bomb might travel more than 3 miles forward after release. A mere 5-second miscalculation in release timing could displace impact points by over 1,000 feet. In effect, the jet stream introduced chaos into what had been treated as a deterministic system. It was a revelation as humbling as it was dangerous. The meteorological teams attached to the 8th Air Force scrambled to keep up. At Alconbury and Lavenham, specially equipped B-24 weather aircraft were dispatched daily ahead of bombing formations to collect wind speed data using instrumented dropsondes. These readings were radioed back to England, where analysts plotted upper wind profiles across Europe, but the data were hours old by the time the bombers reached their targets. In the rapidly changing atmospheric conditions of the upper troposphere, yesterday's wind was no guide to today's. Thus, the burden fell again on the men in the plexiglass noses, men like Hanlon, Rosenthal, and Lieutenant Richard Best of the 94th Group, to translate uncertainty into intuition. Best later recalled how he learned to feel wind through the subtle vibration of the aircraft and the motion of smoke trails below. It wasn't calculation anymore, he said. It was judgment. You'd look through that sight, and you'd sense the drift. You could almost see the air carrying the bombs forward before you ever dropped them. This was not mysticism. It was the reassertion of human perception over mechanical assumption, a return to the art of bombing rather than its supposed science. The transition reached its climax in the summer of 1944 during Operation Argument, better known to history as Big Week. From February 20th to February 25th, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces launched a sustained assault on the German aircraft industry, the first truly coordinated campaign against factories across Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt. On those missions, wind velocities exceeded 200 miles per hour in places, yet bombing accuracy improved compared to earlier raids. The reason lay in the field corrections now universally adopted. Every experienced bombardier was releasing early. Some groups adjusted by as much as 12 seconds before the Norden's mechanical release cue. Intelligence analysts reviewing post-strike photographs of Big Week's raids noted a striking pattern. The bomb concentrations no longer fell systematically beyond the targets. Impacts clustered more symmetrically around the aiming points, clear evidence that human compensation had restored what machinery alone could not guarantee. For the crews themselves, the psychological effect was profound. The airmen, who had once been taught to trust the instrument above their own senses, were now learning to trust themselves again. It was a reversal of faith and a quiet act of rebellion against the doctrine that had sent so many to die. Each bombing mission remained a test of nerve. High-altitude frost covered every surface. Oxygen masks froze solid in minutes. Enemy flak erupted around them in concentric bursts, and German fighters Bf-1 10-night interceptors by the dozens attacked from the rear quarters. But for the men in the Bombardiers compartment, time itself became the battlefield. A second too late, and thousands of bombs would overshoot into housing districts or open fields. A second too early, and the target would survive untouched. Between those two errors lay the difference between a successful mission and a wasted sacrifice. Lieutenant Best described the sensation of that moment. When you're lining up, the world goes silent. The engines, the flak, everything fades. There's just the crosshairs, the stopwatch in your mind, and the knowledge that you're about to drop the weight of a small town on a place you can't even see clearly. That silence, broken only by the metallic clatter of bomb shackles releasing, became the sound of adaptation itself. The scientific aftermath of these field improvisations was just as significant. Meteorologists, collaborating with captured German weather data after the war, confirmed that the 8th Air Force had been flying through one of the strongest jet streams on record. Some altitudes over northern Germany recorded winds exceeding 230 miles per hour. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army Air Force's Operational Research Section found that mean impact error due to uncorrected upper wind drift could exceed 1,500 feet. Pre-release compensation, as practiced informally by combat crews, reduced that error by nearly half. The discovery transformed not only bombing accuracy, but meteorology itself. The Allied understanding of high-altitude winds directly influenced the design of post-war jet aircraft, which would later exploit the same streams for fuel efficiency, rather than fight against them. And yet, for the men who lived it, the discovery was not scientific triumph, but quiet vindication. Through blood and trial that the air invisible, untouchable, was as real an enemy as any soldier on the ground. When the war ended, the Norden bombsight was celebrated as one of the technological marvels that had brought victory. It was displayed in museums and parades, its legend undiminished. But those who had relied on it in combat carried a more complex memory. Major James Hanlon, the same bombardier who had first defied the site's command over Leipzig, later reflected that the bombsight had never truly failed them. It had merely told half the truth. "It gave us the math," he said in an interview years later, "but the air gave us the rest." By 1945, as the B-29 Superfortress campaign began over Japan, the lessons of Europe had already been absorbed. Crews were briefed on high-altitude wind corrections as formal doctrine. The very technique born of improvisation became institutionalized science. The irony could not have been greater. The perfection of mechanical bombing had depended, in the end, on the rediscovery of human judgment. In the cold logic of history, this adaptation might seem a minor technical adjustment, a few seconds difference in release timing. But in truth, it represented something far deeper, the reconciliation of man and machine under the pressures of modern war. What began as defiance of doctrine evolved into the very refinement of it. The bombardiers of the 8th Air Force had not abandoned the promise of precision. They had saved it. By learning to release their bombs before the target, by trusting instinct where instruments faltered, they proved that precision was not merely a product of machinery, but of human perception tempered by experience. And in doing so, they transformed the skies over Germany from a proving ground of technology into a crucible of understanding where the invisible wind itself became both enemy and teacher. For when the war finally ended, and the Korate, factories they had destroyed lay silent, the men who had once placed blind faith in the Norden bombsight understood the final irony. The most accurate bombing in history had not come from perfect machines, but from imperfect men who learned to see what the machine could not. By the closing months of 1944, the pattern had become unmistakable. Every analysis chart pinned to the walls of the 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section at High Wycombe told the same quiet story. The crews who released early were hitting more precisely, surviving longer, and wasting fewer bombs. Officially, the reports spoke only of drift compensation and corrected release methodology. Unofficially, everyone called it beating the sight. The very idea would have been heretical only a year earlier. The Norden bombsight had been presented to every trainee as a symbol of perfection so secret that bombardiers swore an oath not to let it fall into enemy hands. Yet here, in the bitter cold skies over Europe, that perfection had been humbled by the most common of natural forces, moving air. What had once been the pride of American technology now became an instrument of adaptation. Crews learned to rely on a complex interplay of visual cues, feel, and instinct. They began timing the drift of shadows on the ground, comparing the movement of smoke columns with compass bearings, even noting the streak of their own contrails against the wind. The Bombardiers' window became a laboratory. On the 95th Bomb Group's mission to Mersburg on November 21, 1944, Lieutenant George Lathrop recorded winds steady from the west at 170 knots. His bombs, released 9 seconds early at 25,000 feet, struck within 200 feet of the Leuna synthetic oil plant's cracking towers, a degree of precision that astonished even the most skeptical analysts. Every successful run felt like solving a Spother riddle that the air had set against us, Lathrop later said. You'd learn its tricks, then the next day it would change again. What made this discovery so psychologically transformative was not simply its technical success. It was the realization that no machine, no matter how sophisticated, could ever fully account for the living chaos of the sky. The war had begun with the promise that science could remove uncertainty, It was ending with the recognition that uncertainty itself was the constant, and that mastery lay in adaptation, not prediction. Behind the scenes, U.S. meteorologists were racing to translate the experiences of the bomber crews into formal data. At the Air Ministry's Meteorological Office in Dunstable, scientists compared flight logs from hundreds of missions, mapping wind velocities across Europe at different altitudes. The resulting charts were the first Allied records of what would later be known as the jet stream. Few outside the scientific world grasped the significance at the time. Yet those wind charts, scrawled in pencil and grease pencil, were as revolutionary in their implications as radar or the atomic bomb. For the first time in aviation history, humans understood that the upper atmosphere was not a void, but a dynamic ocean of motion with currents, eddies, and tempests invisible to the naked eye. The 8th Air Force's unofficial doctrine of early release was, in essence, the first practical response to that invisible ocean. Even the Germans noticed. Intelligence summaries recovered after the war from the Luftwaffe's meteorological service showed that German analysts, puzzled by the improving accuracy of American bombing despite unchanged instruments, speculated that the Allies had developed a new bombsight principle. They were half right. The new principle was not in the machinery, but in the minds of the men using it. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy in June of 1944, the FITO practice had become second nature. Every bombardier entering combat briefing heard the same quiet instruction during the final minutes before takeoff. Check wind. Check drift. Trust your sight, but trust your eyes more. The results were visible not only in post-strike photographs, but in the industrial paralysis that followed. German synthetic oil production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's mechanized forces, fell from 116,000 tons in April to only 30,000 by September. Factory complexes at Leuna, Bohlen, and Zeitz lay in ruins. Even with flak and camouflage, the Luftwaffe could not replace the losses. Those outcomes were not simply the triumph of mass bombing, they were the product of refined precision, achieved not through improved instruments, but through human correction. The irony was exquisite. A war that had begun with engineers promising perfect mechanization of destruction had instead been won by the intuition of men who learned to question their own machines. When the European war ended in May of 1945, thousands of Norden bomb sites were collected, declassified, and eventually displayed in museums. Visitors marveled at the intricate gears and gyros, the mechanical ballet that had once been described as capable of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel. But the veterans who walked past those displays saw something different. They saw the compromise between ideal and reality, the moments when math had met weather, and the world had refused to fit neatly into the formulas they had been taught. One bombardier, Captain Charles McDonnell of the 93rd Group, put it simply during a reunion in the 1960s. "We learned that precision doesn't come from a machine. It comes from a man who knows when the machine is lying." As the Cold War dawned, the lessons carried forward. When the U.S. Air Force designed its new generation of radar bombsights and computing systems for the Time Auffassungsstations B-50 and B-52 bombers, the algorithms incorporated variable high-altitude wind corrections, the mathematical formalization of what Hanlon, Rosenthal, and Lathrop had done by instinct. Even modern cruise missile guidance owes part of its logic to those wartime adjustments. Prediction blended with correction, calculation balanced by feedback. The bombs that once fell by the judgment of a man now fall by the code written to imitate him. Yet the story remains, at its core, profoundly human. In those years between 1942 and 1945, tens of thousands of young men climbed into aluminum aircraft and placed their faith in mathematics to guide them through chaos. They watched their friends vanish in clouds of flak, their targets dissolve in haze, their instruments fail them at the worst possible moments, and they adapted anyway. They learned, quite literally, to drop faith before the target. Late in his life, Lieutenant Hanlon was interviewed by a historian compiling oral accounts of the 8th Air Force. Asked how it felt to release bombs before the crosshairs reached the aiming point, he smiled faintly. "It felt wrong every time. he said. Your training fights you. Everything you were taught says, wait for the mark. But you learn to trust what the air tells you. You learn that the target isn't where the sight says it's where it will be. He paused, looking down at his hands. That's the thing about war. The truth is always moving ahead of you. In the end, the decision to release early to defy doctrine and trust experience was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was a metaphor for the entire Allied war effort, an industrial nation learning, through trial and failure, that even the most advanced systems require the humility to adapt. The men of the 8th Air Force did not win their war because they had the best machines. They won because they learned that precision comes from doubt, the moment when a man looks at perfection and decides it needs to be corrected. And somewhere above the grey skies of Germany, where the contrails once twisted in invisible rivers of air, that lesson still drifts silent, unseen, but enduring. The war did not end for the bombardiers when the guns fell silent over Europe. For many, it only shifted from the mechanical precision of the Norden sight to the moral precision of memory. When crews returned to bases in England during the spring of 1945, they found the world strangely muted. Hangars stood half empty. New recruits trained without urgency. On cloudy mornings, the grass runways smelled of damp oil and thawing mud. Men who had once calculated wind drift and target elevation to the last yard now found themselves wondering how to measure the distance between what they had believed and what they had done. Captain John O'Donnell, of the 303rd Bomb Group, who had perfected the early release technique over Bremen, later wrote that his crew trusted the numbers more than we trusted our own eyes. He meant it literally. By late 1944, most bombing missions were conducted entirely on instruments, the target often invisible beneath cloud and flak. The Bombardiers' task had become an act of faith in mathematics. And yet, when the war was over, O'Donnell found himself replaying not the triumphant hits confirmed by reconnaissance photographs, but the long seconds between the release and the distant impact, that span of helplessness when physics and human will parted ways. The engineers who had made the early drop possible faced their own reckoning. Carl L. Norden's company continued research under the U.S. Navy after 1945, but even Norden admitted privately that the sight's ultimate accuracy had been limited less by its design than by the turbulent realities of the atmosphere. Bombs never fell in laboratory air. Each mission had been a statistical experiment repeated thousands of times. In that sense, the technique of releasing early was less a correction than a confession, an acknowledgement that war could not be mastered by equations alone. In the years immediately following the victory in Europe, many of the same scientists and officers who had refined bombing accuracy at high altitude were recruited into the Strategic Air Command. They brought with them the lessons of drift, wind, and human reaction time. Within a decade, those lessons had evolved into mechanical analog computers that no longer required the bombardier's intuition. The bombsight, once the most secret instrument in the U.S. arsenal, became a museum piece almost overnight, replaced by radar and then by inertial guidance. But the conceptual leap, trusting the unseen correction rather than the visible aim point, endured. It was the seed of an idea that would mature in the era of guided missiles, that the perfect strike occurs not at the moment you see the target, but when you anticipate where it will be. For the men who had learned to lead the target by seconds, the Cold War's new doctrines of first strike and mutually assured destruction carried an uncanny echo. They had once measured the Earth's rotation to drop a single bomb on a bridge. Now entire nations calibrated trajectories for weapons that could erase cities. A few of those veterans became outspoken advocates for arms control. Lieutenant Raymond Holt, formerly of the 92nd Bomb Group, joined the nascent Federation of American Scientists, arguing that accuracy without judgment is the most dangerous illusion of all. Others remained silent, their wartime logbooks tucked away in attics, the pages still marked with penciled wind corrections and the quiet arithmetic of destruction. When historians in the 1970s re-examined the American daylight bombing campaign, they found that the average miss distance in Europe had rarely fallen below 1,000 feet. The early release technique had not magically transformed bombing into a precision art. What it had done was impose order on chaos, giving crews a repeatable method, a sense of control amid uncertainty. Its success was psychological as much as mechanical. Crews who believed in their method flew with steadier hands, held formation tighter, and endured flak longer. In that sense, the illusion of precision became a weapon of morale, one as vital as armor plate or escort fighters. Yet even illusions can yield truth. By studying every deviation, every miss, the U.S. Army Air Forces accumulated the statistical foundation of modern aeronautics, post-war research into ballistic dispersion and wind shear, much of it derived from the 8th Air Force's bomb plot analyses, directly informed civil aviation safety and meteorological science. The knowledge purchased through destruction quietly reshaped the peace that followed. In 1995, at a reunion of the 391st Bomb Group in Dayton, Ohio, a veteran named Charles Wentworth stood before a display case containing a Norden sight. He was 91 years old. He leaned on his cane and stared at the crosshairs behind the glass. When a younger visitor asked if the sight had really worked as advertised, Wentworth smiled faintly. "It worked," he said, "but not the way people think. It taught us that you never hit what you're looking at, you hit what you've learned to believe." That belief that knowledge and faith could fuse in the air above an unseen target defined an entire generation of airmen. They lived suspended between calculation and conscience, between the promise of control and the chaos of war. Their decision to release before the target was more than a tactical adjustment. It was a quiet act of trust in an invisible order, a belief that human reason could anticipate the unpredictable. And so the story closes where it began. In the trembling moment before the bombs fall, when the bombardier's thumb hovers over the release, the aircraft drifts through crosswinds, and the world below is hidden by cloud. In that instant, the mathematics of trajectory become indistinguishable from faith. The bombs leave the bay before the target is in sight, and somewhere beyond calculation, beyond the reach of instruments, they find their mark. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.